The Bridge, a Godzilla-MLP Crossover by Tarbtano. Chapter 3, Impact Canterlot. Twilight clumsily flapped her wings, trying to gain some distance as her jaw nearly dropped. Draped in a rainbow spectrum of light, a tall being, greater in height to the Princess of the Night herself, settled its hooves down on her floor. The lights dimmed, and the being's horn seemed to draw in the brilliant beams of light like it was absorbing them. Smooth, polished chitin gleamed with radiance as the newcomer lowered her wings against her body. She smiled pleasantly at the unicorn, but Twilight was near ready to cast a concussive spell. It might have a horn and wings, but the hole-filled hooves, exoskeleton, and draping mane clearly told her this was no alicorn. She was a changeling, and a queen at that. In the unicorn's mind, presumably a queen she knew well. The changeling nodded slowly, not at all reacting to the young mare's spiteful glare and her horn glowing as Twilight put herself between the intruder and the still sleeping Spike.
Please, I must have a word with you, Miss Sparkle,
the changeling said in a bell-like voice.
Not today, Chrysalis!
Twilight barked out as she mentally clicked on a spell to fire a blast that would hopefully blow the intruder into the next century, only for two tiny voices to cut off her concentration mid-through.
Her name isn't Chrysalis. She is Mothra.
Twilight instantly ceased the glowing charge of magic and looked around for the source. The voice sounded off almost as if it was right next to her, yet no one was present. The changeling, apparently named Mothra, giggled as she spoke.
Laura, Ma, I think it's best she could see you before you start confusing her.
Mothra ignited her horn briefly into a gentle glow, casting a brief wave that reached across the entire room like a bubble as her horn glows a brilliant rainbow of hues, revealing two tiny sparkling balls of light, one blue, one red, hovering before the bewildered Twilight. Twin tiny voices speaking in unison chimed out.
Hello, friend.
Twilight looked wide-eyed at the sight before her. She'd studied as much about magic as she possibly could, according to Celestia's word, even surpassing Starswirled in a few categories. But never had she seen anything like this. The orbs didn't seem to be pure energy, as a faint outline of a figure was visible if one looked hard enough, but no features at all were visible, just a vague outline. It was almost as if something wasn't fully there. That is when she finally looked the changing monarch over. For one, her chitin color was all wrong for Chrysalis, being a near pure white with a slightest green tint, rather than the dark gray chrysalis bone. The mane was in a much more well-kempt uniform manner as it draped down, and it was a light green hue. The tail was in identical condition. The eyes were beautiful in a strange way, even for a creature as odd as a changeling. This being, Mothra as the orbs called her, had twin double-layered irises with emerald and sky blue rings around the pupils. Looking to her back made the difference all too noticeable. Instead of hole-filled sharp see-through fly-like wings, this changeling had a barrage of colors clad across the pair of butterfly-like wings. Mothra's calm, gentle voice whispered to the alicorn.
I am known in my home realm as Mothra, Guardian of Earth. This, however, is not my normal state. I apologize if I alarmed you.
Twilight caught her breath and stood firm, looking up into the green and blue orbs, not quite knowing what to make of all this.
She looks and sounds convincing enough, but what was all this about realms? What are these two bright talking lights? How did she even get in here? Changelings can disguise themselves as other ponies they see. Perhaps they could even make a unique design? Better safe than sorry.
Twilight held her hoof out as she spoke.
There's a certain queen you resemble that's a shape-shifting monster. I'd rather have never met. I'm not the distrusting type, but she caused me and my friends calamity twice now. I am a student of magic, and I've since learned a spell that reveals changelings' disguises. May I use it on you so I can be sure this is your true form?
The changeling nodded before replying.
Of course, anything is needed.
Mothra stood still and closed her eyes as Twilight's horn gleamed with energy, hoping her own trust wasn't misplaced. Miles away in Canterlot, Princess Luna trod along through the lonely halls, banishing the last pangs of tiredness from her body. Celestia had been away on business, leaving her younger sibling to manage the castle and celestial affairs. She'd gotten up some minutes ago after taking a nap to prepare to lower the sun and raise the moon, taking a stroll to stretch out and wake up, but not without grumble in her stride.
Celestia put up with this dual shift for a millennium? No wonder why she eats so many sweets. This much stress would put some ponies in a coma.
Rolling her eyes, Luna looked out to the dimming horizon. Her horn was still aching from last night, the same time Celestia and, according to the messenger scroll, Cadence had their horns act up. The latter poor girl was hit so harshly she passed out. The aching wasn't what disturbed her the most though. This was a case where the cause and not the effect had her attention. Luna's horn flickered through the discomfort. The cosmos above began to shift to a sunset. A curtain of twilight and then night slipped over Canterlot to steadily spread over the whole of Equestria in a dark, peaceful wave.
3 out of 4 alicorns with sudden pain. Add young Miss Sparkle to the ranks, and that's the whole group with seemingly no others sharing the experience.
Luna looked out across the landscape, watching the distant forms of other ponies going about their business.
Our kind always was more in tune with the world and its changes than the normal equines. If something disrupted the realm, that could...
A sudden deep rumble shocked the palace, booming out from the east end and banishing Luna's previous thoughts. Gaining her wits, the knightly princess galloped full speed down the hallways, bounding off the slickened red carpet and taking wing, gliding down the flight of stairs. The sound of conflict, yelps, bangs, thumps, and hollers of guards tore through the air as Luna passed the main hall of the east end. She stopped briefly and beheld the sight. There was a massive hole, easily a dozen feet across in diameter, that had ripped through the ceiling. Scattered pieces of metal roofing, concrete, wood splinters, and all that held the castle's roof and floors together were strewn all across the floor. Several beaten guards lay upon near an impact crater of shattered tile. The small groans gave fleeting relief that they were alive, but in need of medical attention. That's when she saw the tracks. Hoofprints, massive ones, were leading out of the crater. They were set into the floor, almost like they had been burned through them. Passing a guard as she followed the gradually shallower and less burnt prints, Luna noticed the armor on her flank had actually been similarly burned, so much so that the golden metal on the outside was practically melted. A yell drew up her attention, calling her out into the main hall. Racing forward, Luna ran past several panicking and bruised nobles and the palace workers. A fight was still going on, with half a dozen guards rushing about and dueling with an absolutely monster-sized stallion. Even Shield Crash, one of the largest guards on the staff, was a full head or so shorter and easily half the mass of this pony. The closer Luna got, the more it became clear this was the largest stallion she had ever seen, so much so that she nearly mistook him for a horse at first. It seemed to be a unicorn, but was fighting with tooth and hoof rather than using magic, and doing a fine job at it even if his manner was unorthodox. Instead of focusing on bucking and kicking, he was mostly bashing away castle defenders with body shoves, bashing his forelimbs of all things. But the strength disparity was obvious when Shield Crash's forward charge was stopped cold by the monstrous unicorn biting him across the back, armor sparing him from the enlarged canines the newcomer bore, before he was yanked off his hooves and tossed across the hall. The unicorn's coat was a charcoal gray with a spiny patch of ivory fur along the back that stood up slightly. The mane and tail were a dull gray-green, very rigid and spiky. The tail especially, while clearly hair, resembled a spiny fin as much as it did an equine tail. The cutie mark was bafflingly odd. It was a symbol of some sorts that she was unfamiliar with. A circle with 3 trapezoids surrounding it, with the smaller face pointing inwards. Several more royal night guards charged in, and Luna, unable to magically blast the unruly stallion for fear of striking some of her own guard, looked on. They piled on top of the odd pony, literally covering it from near head to toe in an attempt to drag it down. The force of numbers did seem to finally pull him down, and they seemed to crumble for the floor. It almost worked. The pony's mane and tail flashed a blue light that blared out from the gaps between the guards, and a shockwave ripped through his body and all who were touching him. Guards were thrown across the room like beach balls, skidding across the floor or impacting the walls before slipping into unconsciousness. The attack would have given Luna thought for pause if it had been any other situation. For while it was definitely energy-based, the lack of glow from the intruder's horn and the odd sensation showed it to not be magic. The stallion stood unfazed before slowly shifting its head to look at Luna, snorting like a mad bull with streaks of blue smoke steaming from his maw as he spoke. Unfortunately, his attempts at calming his breath and pulse to clear his dazed head were complicated by frustration. His situation, which worked to make him come off as more hostile than intended.
pests. Even against this tiny form, they fall. Be glad I didn't kill them. I'm not in the best mood after being attacked so suddenly. Now, if your kind would be courteous enough not to try to dogpile me on sight, where...
Luna was near her temper's breaking point. Her starry mane waved along in the windless room as she stood atop the stairs. Her voice was a chorus of anger.
You, who do you think you are? Assaulting the Celestial Castle, attack its staff and guards, and then have the audacity to bark forth at a Diarch.
The stallion rolled his eyes, looking and talking back in a half-disgusted manner.
I didn't start this, you witch! If that group are the elite, then your minions best not be brought against me, lest an accident happen.
Luna's eyes snapped into a white plane as a bright white stream of energy ripped out of her horn, yelling out in a voice not often heard for 1,000 years.
Enough!
The stallion didn't have any time to react before a beam slammed into him, sending him flying back and crashing into the wall. Luna canceled out her attack, her face still stern with a glare as she watched the darkness the hole in the wall her foe had crashed through provided. Red and yellow eyes briefly glared through the darkness back at her, before the entire hole was gushing out a brilliant blue and white light. Luna barely had time to dodge to the side, the tip of her wing feathers being singed slightly by a stream of burning heat energy that smashed through the stained glass window behind her and into the skies beyond. The beam continued for a second or two before it was cut off like a silenced flame. The stallion slowly walked out of the gaping hole in the wall, his mane and tail still glowing as flickers of blue sparks slipped out of his maw. His torso was still smoking from Luna's attack, obviously having been damaged, but the pain seemingly only added fuel to his fire. His expression was one of pure rage. He stomped his hoof into the ground, cracking tiles and shaking the room as Luna was unmoved.
I am Godzilla, king of the monsters. And for these attacks, you and your kind have just managed to piss me off!
Back at Sweet Apple Acres, Sweetie Belle and Skulu screamed as they dove behind the wagon for cover. Destroyah charging over them, only barely avoiding crushing the pair underfoot due to her long stride. The two standing Timberwolves snarled and split up, one charging to meet her head-on, as the other circled around. The charging wolf and the alicorn rammed into each other, rearing up on their hind legs in a massive ball of anger and rage. Hooves bucked and snapping branches as splintered claws racked against the equine's hide, leaving green fluid to spill out. Destroyah snarled in pain and rammed her right hoof forward, bashing through branches, bark, and leaves, ripping out through the beast's wind backbone. The alicorn chuckled grimly to herself as she assured a paralyzing blow, only for her face to turn to bewilderment as the wolf, unfazed by the blow, clamped its jaws down on her left forelimb. The former kaiju yelped out in pain, staggering back as the wolf's spine and torso reformed. Gritting her teeth, Destroyah tried to shake her attacker off.
It reforms too easily to leave any lasting wounds.
Her thought was cut off by the wooden lupin releasing her bleeding forelimb and lunging for her neck. Sweetie Belle and Scootaloo looked in horror, almost certain what was about to follow. And then Destroyah remembered a certain trait about her horn, one she used against a previous foe that regenerated. The alicorn's horn ignited with a hellfire as she swung down, leaving a red streak to fly through the air as she brought the horn down on the still lugging Timberwolf's head. The wood was no defense against the energized horn. Searing hot energy burned through it as much as it did cut through the timbers. The Timberwolf didn't even have time to yelp before its head was bisected. It's broken into halves, smoking as they fell to the ground. The body stood still for a moment before crumbling down in a heap of twigs and leaves like a castle of cards. Destroyah snarled, spitting on the corpse as she heard a second series of charging footsteps behind her. The demonic being could almost giggle. She may be more vulnerable, but no less armed. And now that she won't be caught by surprise by some cheap parlor tricks, there was no doubt. 1-on-1, 2-on-1, 5-on-1, they don't stand a chance now. Spinning around as her mane crackled with purple energy, Destroyah threw open her maw as a spray of white vapor and purple steam ripped loose from her jaws, impacting the remaining Timberwolf. Its body was instantly enveloped by micro-oxygen that tore each of its cells to shreds. The corpse fell to the ground, its entire body, save for a few twigs and leaves, entirely turned to the same vapor Destroyah breathed to feed. Destroyah hissed gleefully as she fed herself vaporized cells, always a favored taste. Shifting her gaze up to the last Timberwolf, who either in foolhardy attempt to feed or flee and hid from its comrade's killer, was clawing its way over to the wagon and the two shivering forms. Just as it dove its wind skull into the space of the overturned wagon and a pair of screams echoed out, Destroyah grabbed the beast by its hind legs and ripped it back. The wind monster yelped, flailing about as a hiss of micro-oxygen sliced through the air. The Timberwolf flailed more and more as less and less of it was physically there. One last howl weakly eased out before all that was left was a pile of residue and vapor, the latter being sucked into the horned Pegasus mare's maw. Sweebel and Skulu, still shaking with fright, poked their heads out from under the wagon as Destroyah absorbed the last of her meal. She stood tall and fanned her wings to try and ease her muscles. Green liquid was leaking off of her neck, shoulder, and arms, making her already ragged appearance even worse. She, however, paid little attention as she looked down at the fillies with a devil's smile. Just as she was about to fire another blast of her signature oxygen destroyer, a jolting pain ripped out from within her.
What's wrong with me? Ah!
Gasping for breath and clinging her gut, Destroyah barely had time to grasp her stomach before doubling over, unable to move as she started shaking violently. The last thing she saw before passing out was two fillies rushing up to her, joined by a red-haired equine of the same age, tolled by an older mare and stallion that ran up from the path leading to the barn. Back at the library, the bubble of purple magic that cloaked Mothra's body faded into a brilliant display as the anti-changeling spell dissipated. The royal changeling remained unchanged, and a gleeful smile warmed over Twilight's face as she spoke.
Well, that should do it. Sorry about that, miss.
Mothra nodded before walking across the room and up to the young alicorn.
Don't be. Your suspicion was well-founded. Odd sensation this world's magic has. Familiar, though.
Mothra shot her an amused smile and nodded. At that moment, Twilight's eyebrow raised again. Obviously, both curious and confused, her inner desire for knowledge was sparking once more, risking a flame.
You keep saying you're from somewhere else. Where? Is it in Equestria or somewhere distant? You don't act much like a changeling.
Mothra's wings fluttered as her mind raced. As knowledgeable as she was, mostly due to the inherited memories of her predecessors, thanks to the infant island's mysticism, this world was more foreign to her than anything she had ever known.
I fear the place I called home is very, very distant. I was transported here for what I can only believe to have been some sort of bizarre accident.
She paused to look at her form, speaking solemnly while inspecting a hoof.
The transfer somehow changed my body accordingly. If the others have arrived in the same place, something similar must have happened to them.
Twilight's eyes widened as the sparks to gather more knowledge grew in a raging flame. Extraterrestrial beings? Other worlds? Foreign magic? All questions she had since foalhood were standing right before her, and there were more of her kind here? Millions of questions ripped through her mind as a grin gathered upon her face.
How many are there? What spells do you know? Can they all do magic? Can you teach me? Got any books?
Mothra giggled at the teenager's glee. Seeing happiness of others always was something she rarely got to witness back home, and it never failed to please her. This young mare seemed near ecstatic.
Patience, patience, Twilight. Don't burst yourself. Before we get into details, I must ask if you have any star maps. If I recognize any patterns, I might be able to tell you exactly where I am from. Do you have any?
Twilight smirked, trotting off to the astrology section of the library with Mothra in tow.
You couldn't have come to a better spot in Ponyville.
Spike slept peacefully through it all. Several minutes later at Fluttershy's cottage, Zanil sat calmly on the hardwood floor, his horn and shoulder patches glowing as he levitated a teacup over himself and sipped it. Fluttershy smiled as she added a pinch more sugar to her cup while she sat down on her couch. The Pegasus swallowed her sip and tilted her head curiously as she asked her inquiry.
So, you say there might be 6 of your friends here as well?
Zanilla flinched at the hot tea as much as he did her words. Against this mare, he dare not lie lest he get that glare of hers again. Any inconvenience he could live without as well as avoid. Still, he could bend the truth a little as he told his tale.
Friends, would be a rough term. Destroyah would be the closest ally, but yes, there are 6.
Fluttershy was put a bit on the unease side by that name, but continued.
And I take it they'd all be just as confused as you were?
Zanilla glanced over at the patched up floor where his crystals once stood, deciding that label was best to keep things on the calm side.
Likely.
Fluttershy flapped her wings and hovered up, obvious concern on her face.
Oh, then we must go and find them all as soon as possible.
Fluttershy was cut off by her door being bucked open by a very frantic Applejack, who spun around to rush in so fast her hat flew off and needed to be caught.
Fluttershy, we need you down barnside ASAP. Philly's found some big red mare and she's hurt bad. Doc's another 30 minutes out, so you gotta come down and...
Applejack stopped her sentence short as she looked up at the massive form of Zanilla standing before her, obvious surprise clad on her expression.
Well, howdy.
Zanilla lowered down and looked at the mare on eye level.
What shade of red would you say she was?
30 minutes later at the Canterlot Palace. A mass explosion cued a shockwave that tore through the whole palace. In the Commons Hall, the wave-rattling foundation cracked and shattered half of the windows that stood still in one piece, as 2 forms dueled in the main hallway. Luna and Godzilla had been fighting through several rooms and corridors, leaving the palace in utter disarray and wreckage in their wake. Diving under a heat ray that burned through several walls behind her, Luna flapped her wings to gain speed as she charged the stallion head-on. Putting her forehooves out, they connected with Godzilla's torso and yanked the kaiju unicorn off his feet, still firing off his ray from his maw, and narrowly missing the chance to fry the Night Princess's back. They continued to sail through the air until they hit the massive wind gate to the garden. The speed Luna was flying at and their combined mass being enough to smash through the latch and a shower of splinters into the outside world. Arching her back, Luna kicked out with her hind legs and launched her foe away from her and into the pond. Quickly erupting out of the churned waters almost as soon as he landed, Godzilla stood up to his full height and glared at his foe that hovered about 15 feet above. He had not been at full form during his confrontation with the other equines, odd as it was to think of his current company as being such. But even so, he had not been using everything he could until Luna escalated the fight. Bash them around, throw them aside, bite the armored areas, just knock them around till they yield, but not maim. Yet this one was unrelenting. The Kaiju King panted and cast a small smirk.
I must say, I'm impressed.
Luna only sneered in response, her anger making her modern accent slip.
Keepeth thine compliments in thine maw, brute. Why hath ye besieged our lands and populace?
Both of the two were nearly at the point of huffing for breath. After fighting for nearly a half an hour now, both were fairly well bruised, scratched, and beaten. Godzilla grumbled as he glanced his eyes down at the frosted wound on his chest, inflicted by Princess Luna's projectile assault some minutes earlier. Either the inhabitants of this world had some special qualities or his powers were changed as much as his body had. But whichever it was, he wasn't healing as quickly as he should be. Both or neither could be the cause. The pain only enraged him more as he swallowed it in.
I acted in self-defense. You and your race are the aggressors here. I didn't start this battle, but I will finish it!
Godzilla snarled as his mane and tail glowed a white light, just the same as the waves of bright white energy collected by the princess's horn. Streams of starry white and torrent of blue flames ripped through the air at the same time, and both missed, yet also found their mark. Soon enough, the castle walls were alight with war fire beyond most were capable. Princess Luna rapidly appeared and disappeared in bursts of blue magic, teleporting about the room to dodge the oncoming salvos of plasma fired at her positions. She shot out of her reappeared location and flew towards the roof, arching around mid-air with her arched back skillfully maneuvering and rolling out of the way from another torrent of white-blue burning light, spiraling down as she tucked her wings in. The alicorn's horn coils, sparks, and bursts with radiance of their own. Godzilla halted his breath weapon, needing to recharge after having swept it around the room and halls to try and hit the offending alicorn. His burning wrath had cut large holes into the walls and ceiling, giving the castle some new skylights as a dozen or 200 kilograms worth of construct rubble came falling down. He couldn't pay much heed to it, much as he wished he could keep track of such things, because soon his forearm was pockmarked and impacted by Luna's magical darts. Some exploded on contact with transmitted kinetic force that rattled his bones. Others seemed to stab into his hide before burning into him. The Kaiju King held back and gasped in pain as he swagged to his knee under the onslaught of the diving alicorn. Unable to get out of the way, all he could do was try to heal back the damage and brace for what he did see coming. Princess Luna stopped her barrage and seemed to wrap her body in her own aura while rapidly pounding her wings and sticking her hooves before her. Little could he have possibly known, an alicorn was not just a winged unicorn or horned Pegasus. Once experienced, they were all three races combined together in a gestalt gathered in the sum of parts. Pegasus high-speed flight, unicorn telekinesis, throwing her mass forward and bolstering defense, and earth point construction and physically manipulation that could refrain the body as easily as it could promote plant growth. All in all, it meant Princess Luna slammed into her foe like an oncoming train, and he definitely felt it more than she did. A loud snap from both the forearm, her blow hit snapping internally, as well as the crushing of the ground under his hooves, crunching down hard enough to form a crater. For the briefest of seconds, she saw his face contort in pain. Princess Luna half worried she'd killed him on the spot. She'd hit harder than she would on a normal pony because this Godzilla certain to provide to be nothing of the sort. But did she just... His eyes dilated and turned white with unbridled fury at whatever destructive force her foe bore that she could clearly tell wasn't magic. The monstrous unicorn lunged forward and body slammed into the alicorn, shoving her into the ground and bear hugging her with his good forelimb. Godzilla's mane and tail crackled with power, and there was a brief flash of blue from all points of his body in contact with the alicorn. Princess Luna was hit full force with the conductive nuclear plasma shockwave and was sent flying back like a pinball, first smoking in trails behind her. Godzilla staggered and huffed, grimacing while holding his broken arm as the bone inside tried to mend together, perhaps mentally urging it to regenerate faster. His hopes were dashed when the alicorn again disappeared into a burst of blue magical light. At the same time, much of the falling rubble was grabbed in a similarly colored blue magic aura and hurled at his position. Swearing, Godzilla held his half-healed limb while ignoring the strain upon his energy reserves, dropping open his maw to spew out bursts of plasma to shoot down any projectiles he could. Then a burst of blue light behind him got his attention and he whipped around. Princess Luna's eyes widened when she realized her foe had wised up to her teleportation, flanking and had whirled around to greet her with a face full of fangs and fires. Her horn ignited and a shield cast abruptly to hold back the onslaught. Her carried momentum fighting against the kinetic force of all the searing torrent. With her focus taken away, she lost control and hurled debris, and with Godzilla's focus on the alicorn, he turned his back to it. Two caught up with each other. Neither noticed the half-ton slab of concrete crushing into the both of them and sending the dueling two rulers through a brick wall until it was too late.